Micky Bayonne is a poet and educator whose work explores themes of identity, place, disaster, and ecology. Originally from Louisiana, they hold an MFA from the Iowa Writers' Workshop in Poetry. Micky is the current Provost Visiting Writer in Poetry at the University of Iowa. Following Micky's interview, stay tuned for more discussion with Lisa Roberts, founding director of Iowa City Poetry. Lisa earned her BA at Princeton University and MA at the University of Virginia. Over 18 years, she taught literature and writing at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, University of Virginia, University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and the University of Nebraska. After moving to Iowa City, she served as assistant director of the Iowa Youth Writing Project and worked to bring free creative writing workshops to children throughout eastern Iowa. Her poems have appeared in Plain Songs, The Untidy Season, an anthology of Nebraska women poets, and Little Village. She has performed spoken word poems at a variety of shows, including Was the Word, Voice Box, and The Hook.
Riffles and Eddies. The levee hit the mark. We felt we had nothing but a deep sea regret, like shores eating their own granules, feeding to be full, not to be fed. The times the task grew so wide, the people and the dancers felt burdened. All those mammoths killed for tusks, and I have never held ivory. Next time you eat a fish, I hope the bones grow in your throat, slivers of cartilage raising their sails against your voice. Open your mouth to the saline, and you may start floating. I had a hard time staying out of love with you, even when the ship signaled for my return. I was only meant to find something worth bringing back. I wanted to send you in my steed. Remember the water cure, finding a moment to keep softly, to hide. I was not afraid to die, but was not willing to let anything in. You knew me so well. You said that the ending would not be so bad. You knew that lying was the way out. All we desired was a place to be selfish. They found us buried to our ankles in sweat, enough to sink the gulf, tired and teary eyed, burying ourselves. Likened to a god, absence is a relic of sociogenesis. We felt the send up when it occurred, a deep blackening of surf. Why do the people inland fear the coast? We are the ones left here, dying.
That's quite an opening. All of you there in library land, welcome. This was, does this poem have a title?
Yeah, it's Riffles and Eddies.
Riffles and Eddies with Micky Bayonne. Thank you so much for joining us here today. Oh my gosh, I haven't started a program with poetry before, and now I feel like I'm on my heels. That was beautiful.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Thanks for joining us today. I was just wondering, for all of you out there in library land, you should know this is a great poet right in, if you're from the Cedar Rapids area, our backyard, so to speak. Just down the corridor, Micky is in Iowa City teaching poetry, creating poetry. You're a musician and a visual artist. There's a lot going on. It's true. I was just wondering, as a matter of introduction, do you mind telling us like where your life has kind of taken you geographically and then how you got to Iowa City?
Right. I mean, I often tell people that I've lived in every region except for like the actual like wild, wild west. I'm originally from the South, from Louisiana, spent some time in Florida in my youth. And then I moved to the Northeast. I went to undergraduate in Connecticut. And I spent some time right before I got here to Iowa City in Portland, Oregon. And then I moved here to Iowa City to go to the writer's workshop about almost 3 years ago.
I feel like we're really lucky to have you here. This is great. When I heard all of the saline and the water, I felt like I was on the coast. I mean, it says it at the end of the poem, right? It's there, but I felt like it. you have to have lived by the water to feel that.
Yeah.
And I mean, it was a surprise for me because I didn't know what you were reading. And I just felt like I got washed into that.
Hmm.
That was really lovely. Like, do you feel like all your different localities and regions and people that you've come into contact with, like, how has that informed your work as an artist? And you can speak to music and visual arts as well as poetry if it's appropriate, but
Yeah. I mean, I think I'm really inspired by like nature a lot. So experiences that I've had um, in a beach or in a forest or on a hike, seeing the natural landscapes really influence me a lot, and really make me feel this kind of like reverence for the world that I live in. And I think that that is like really a through line in a lot of my poems, how to describe nature using words. How do I describe the moment I like stood on the coast of Louisiana and looked out at the Gulf? And obviously, there's not really a way to put words to that. But being influenced by not just like seeing nature, but also like the scientific terms for certain phenomena, that kind of thing, trying to include that in my work a lot.
I think it's just so interesting that how you said that, you can't put that stuff into words. Like, we all experience the same world.
Right.
I mean, from time to time, I still wonder if the color purple that I see is what the color purple other people see. But, we inhabit these environments together, but the way that they touch us and influence us is so different that you can really have very different experiences standing in the same place. And I think that's so interesting that, like, I never really considered that before. And having experienced so many different kinds of environments, like different kinds of coasts, and um, how how that kind of like programs your interior a little and changes the way that you interact with different environments. It's like you have a familiarity with these differences, and I wonder how that plays into our experiences with nature. I don't know.
Yeah.
This is just gonna turn into me talking. I'm like, this is the best conversation ever. Well, I was wondering. Well, go ahead.
Oh no.
Oh, well, I was wondering, like, when you teach poetry,
Mhm.
how do you approach teaching poetry to, is it mostly undergraduate students and the general public through Iowa City Poetry?
Yeah. So, it's often people different, with like varying degrees of both interest and experience in poetry. Um, so one of the things is like my first undergraduate poetry class I taught, I had to remind myself they don't know all of these academic words for, what's going on in the poem, stanza breaks, line breaks, all that. So really having to understand how to deliver that vocabulary to them, but also help them understand that you have to use that vocabulary to talk about a poem, right? So encouraging them to become more knowledgeable about poetry, like capital P poetry, but also trying to make sure that they feel comfortable with whatever they are bringing to a poem, which is just like their life experience, and the way that that poem is impacting them. Like both of those things are just as valid. Right. Yeah. I think of teaching as an opportunity to expose my students to work that they probably have never heard of before, or types of poetry that they have not experienced because they're so used to the canon. I mean, it's surprising to me how many like upper level English majors come to me, and they really don't know any of the like poets that are making poetry now. Um, and they don't know about like the diversity in the poetry field right now. So I like to use it as an opportunity to talk academically about the work of people like Dana Smith, Franny Choi, Ocean Vuong, these people who are recently coming out with stuff. These poets who my students are going to grow up with, and those are going to be the poets of their time. So already trying to figure out how do we bring this into an academic context. Um, when for reasons that like just aren't clear to me, that they're not already, you know, considered canon. Even though I would say that those are like some of the poets at the forefront right now. But it's not canon yet. So bringing that into the classroom and bringing that legitimacy to the poems as well. Yeah.
I don't think that you don't see it on the new bookshelf when you browse the new books at the library. And I think that it's not only just about people represented, but like as a genre, I don't feel like it gets its dues either.
No, I mean, one of my favorite things to assign my students at the beginning of the semester is like an excerpt from Ben Lerner's The Hatred of Poetry, which is just this book where he's talking about, or the excerpt that I use is him talking about like the idea of like representing yourself as a poet to someone casually, like when someone asks you, what do you do? Not saying that you're a poet, instead being like, oh, I'm a writer, I'm a teacher, I'm an artist, and not wanting to identify yourself as a poet. And the excerpt really speaks to me because I've had so many experiences where I'm like, okay, yeah, I'm a poet. And then people are like, read me a poem right now. Say a poem right now. I'm like, or like your favorite poem, or like, and you know, it's just interesting telling people that you're a poet as if that is a career. Yeah, and not that there's like embarrassment with it, but there's a feeling that like the other people aren't going to understand, or that like you'll start having a conversation with someone that'll eventually make them feel uncomfortable because they don't have like a lot of knowledge about poems, right? I tell them, oh, my favorite poet is Lucille Clifton, and they're like, mm-hmm. You know. And I think that there's just such a distance between poetry and people's everyday life now in a way that I don't think is like at the dawn of poetry. That wasn't the case really. Like poetry was about like speaking it, orating it, being in the public. And now poetry is something that like is a little bit more private and a little bit more academic. And it feels like something that like the working class, right, has nothing to do with. Um, so, I mean, that's another reason why in my courses I like to have my students read poems that are written by people who are talking about texting in the poems, talking about Facebook in the poems, talking about tweeting in the poems. I sound like I'm really old saying tweeting, but, talking about those kinds of things so that I can, show them that poetry is alive and well. It's coming out actually right now. And people are talking about the emotional experiences of life in 2020 and 2021 and things like that.
Yeah, we've had, like, how many days are we into 2021, and it's been a big year already, right? Yeah. So I think that's really interesting too, because one, as an artist, experiencing the world is interesting, but as a teaching artist, a teaching poet, like how have you seen anything that's been happening in the world coming through with your students and their expression in their poetry then?
Yeah, I made those faces just because, I mean, specifically this last semester, my course was completely virtual, and it was really sad. I felt like we missed a lot not being able to have the in-class interactions because a poetry workshop is such an intimate thing. It's good to feel like the people that you're sharing your work with and discussing with and things like that. But I noticed like in my students' work, um, a lot of them were kind of trying to grapple with all the current events and the loneliness and the isolation, and the stress, and the fear in their work a lot. Um, and I wanted them to feel like poetry was an outlet, or art in general was an outlet for them to kind of reconcile with the times that we're in right now. Um, and I would just do that using like various writing exercises at the beginning of class, giving them some time to just really like write about the major stressors in their life, and trying to turn those things into like poetry or art or something like that.
What a gift for all of those students that ended up in your poetry class for like the last several semesters. It's been an intense year plus.
Yeah.
And that's such a great, I mean, even though it is a virtual space, and like even right now, like we're virtual, I understand how there's like, it lacks a certain warmth, but
Mhm.
like it's still creating a safe space. And I think because all of those students are together in that space, there's like some alliance that they have still through these kind of unprecedented times.
Yeah.
And so I'm really glad that whoever got in your class the last couple semesters, I'm really glad they were there. I'm really glad they had you too. Have you found that, like, as an artist and a poet, like how you experienced the world changed how you taught at all? Or did you feel like, I don't know, maybe have you been able to write and express yourself artistically more as an outlet or less because it's so crazy?
Yeah, I mean, I think I definitely started out in the pandemic being like, this is when I'm just gonna like write every day, write everything. And I wish I could tell you that I had followed through on that. But I have felt during this time kind of distant from poetry and the idea of poetry and not really sure like what its use is for me right now. And I think a lot of that comes from something I mentioned earlier, like that my poems come from like experiences that I'm having in the world, things that I'm seeing in the world, things that are coming up for me in my day to day life. And right now, my day to day life is like within my home space. Um, and so it hasn't become something that's like a part of my daily routine. Um, but I have taken time to like focus on the other aspects of it, which is like trying to read more poetry, trying to figure out what presses and sending my work out and that kind of thing, instead of focusing so much on like the creative aspect.
That's so interesting to me. Like it kind of just like made my brain explode a little. I mean, like just the thought that, because I feel like I've read more poetry during the pandemic. Like I don't read a ton. I'm sorry, I'm a librarian that doesn't read a ton, but I found that reading's been harder for me. But like I like all the poems, pick up all the poems, and like one here, one there, all different places, all different people, whatever. Like there's always something that I grab onto
Mhm.
because it gives me an experience. I think that's part of the reason why I like poetry too. Like they're small bundles of experiences from inside other people's brains and their feelings and their interactions with the world, right? And then so like I go there to get some sort of interaction, but the people making that don't have those little like synapses, exterior synapses firing kind of that set off these reactions, especially for somebody so involved with nature too. Like physically, we're not going anywhere. Like
Yeah, yeah.
that's wild. Well, I hope that it's not stifling to you.
I don't think it's stifling. I mean, I will say that like time I think I've been more of a way of expressing myself has been through like music or like painting or like just making random things, like just gluing random things to something has felt like an easier way to express myself than like taking on the task of words, and like word curation. um
Well, and I think it's probably a lot of emotional energy too, like curating other people's emotions in poetry, like your students.
yeah.
But you also do workshops for Iowa City Poetry too. And so, like, that's a lot of processing. It would be hard while you're teaching to also spend a lot of time writing, I think. Or maybe it's more inspiring. I suppose everybody's different, but
I mean, I've definitely read some of my students or like workshop participants' work, and it does feel really inspiring. And I mean, it's always inspiring to see someone else having that breakthrough moment, um, with their writing. I mean, because I've been the person participating in the workshop that's getting a lot out of it, and I have no idea how the person on the other side, like where they are with their work at that moment, right? Um, but I mean, it's great. It feels great to see other people having those, okay, like I'm trying to build my practice or I'm trying to find my voice, and being able to be a part of that. I think that like that's a reward enough, um, for me a lot of the times.
and I suppose too, like being an artist is not linear, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we can have goals and like things you want to work on, but it's Not like you're like, well, in 3 years I'm going to have that book of poetry published. And like, who knows where 3 years takes any of us, but especially with art too.
Yeah.
I don't know. Are there any things or places that you do want to focus on in your work? Not, I mean, like in long term, do you have kind of like, when you look at the landscape, are there places you want to go?
Yeah, I mean, I think um, one of my like long-term project ideas has always been to write a book about my family and my family history. I come from a line of Creoles of color in Louisiana, northern Louisiana. And there's like a really rich, interesting history there that unfortunately is like getting lost as people age and get older. Um, and so one of my goals in my like writing life is to one day kind of try to put to words or try to compile that history. But I think before that, there's a lot that I need to do as far as like finding my voice and being able to enter into the shoes of like a character in a poem or someone else. And so that's something that I've been trying to work on or thinking about, just pushing myself further, increasing my skill set, increasing the tools that I can use in a poem, playing around more with like form and space on a page, things that I'm not as comfortable with. So it's always going to be trying to push yourself to grow as an artist in a different way. Um, and that's kind of like what is on the horizon for me. Like, how can I take this further? How can I do more?
It sounds like the sky's the limit.
Yeah.
It's true. Oh, I love that. I think that's like the perfect note to end on. Like, that's so like full of optimism and beautiful, beautiful, wide open space. I'm so grateful that you joined us here today.
Thanks for having me. Yeah.
This has been wonderful. For all of you out there in library land, stay tuned. We're going to show you where you can find some of Micky's work and how to stay in touch with what's going on down in Iowa City. Micky's work can be found in 8 Poems Every Month and on poets.org. You can also find Micky facilitating workshops for Iowa City poetry. Today we have Lisa Roberts, the founding director of Iowa City Poetry, with us. Hello, and thank you for joining us.
Hello, Meredith. Thank you so much for inviting me.
It is a pretty exciting week for me. I have been able to have conversations with several local poets. Lisa, you are a poet yourself, not just an administrator of nonprofits in the area. But I was wondering, could you start by kind of introducing all of us in library land to Iowa City Poetry and how it came into being?
I'd be very happy to do that, Meredith. Well, our mission is to share poetry resources with everyone. So that means adult writers and readers of all ages, incomes, identities, and experience levels. And so we got started because we're in this amazing place. We're in Iowa City. That's a designated UNESCO City of Literature, and as we know, home to the Iowa Writers Workshop. So here we are, we've landed in this amazing place. How do we sort of create, cross-pollination and bring some of the resources from the university out into the larger community, but also when I arrived here in 2011, it became clear to me that there were, sort of projects attempting to encourage this kind of communication and this kind of interaction between the community and the university. I mean, that's one of the missions of the university, right? And so there was the Iowa Youth Writing Project that was bringing incredible undergraduate and graduate poets and novelists and playwrights out to children in the community. And then a little bit later, I learned about the Iowa Summer Writing Festival, right? Where during the summer, all the amazing writers who've come through the university offer workshops during the summer. And people come from all over the country to take these week-long workshops. And then even more recently, there's the Iowa Writers House. And so Andrea Wilson, Alicia Jedala, they, created the Iowa Writers House again, to try to tap into these rich resources in our area, the talented writers, and make that available to everyone in the community. Unfortunately, the Writers House has disbanded. I think, the pandemic was just too rough on it. And so we see ourselves kind of in that vein, though we're not affiliated with the university at all. We're a community writing organization. But we really want to, sort of inspire that kind of conversation and that kind of sharing of resources. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that I really appreciate how empowering that is to the community too, because I think that I went to school at the university and I was in the English department. And, so even more, I was like, ooh, the writer's workshop. And, you're surrounded by all these creative people. I mean, just because it's a university town, let alone the writer's workshop. But I really appreciate how that wall between the university and the general public comes down, and how it goes kind of both ways. Like poetry and artistic creative work becomes accessible to kind of the average person.
Yes.
You don't have to be going to school, and it doesn't have to be on your syllabus. You're not having to publish because you want to get a job somewhere, whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
I think it kind of goes back to what we had mentioned in a conversation about living an enriched life. And I think that's really an important part of a community. It just adds so much value to the quality of life for people.
Well, it does. And we know that reading and writing and attending arts events does that. It sort of, nurtures our creative self and gives us a sense of community that, is in some ways likened to a church community, but in a literary sphere. We all need that. We are social animals. We are finding out even more distressingly during the pandemic. And that's one of the things that we've tried to do. Before the pandemic, we're trying to create those kinds of communities in person. And now we're doing it online until we find a vaccine.
Well, do you think you can speak a little to either how Iowa City poetry looks during the pandemic, or even just the value or what we get from poetry during a time like this?
Oh my goodness. All right. Well, recently Joy Harjo said, U.S. Poet Laureate, poetry hangs out in the spaces of transformation. And that means deaths, births, weddings. And if we are not undergoing a cultural transformation, right now, I don't know.
I could identify one, right?
Right, exactly. On how many levels are we undergoing transformation? And so, we look at times like that to to be uplifted through what? Intense language. We look for something like a prayer or a spell to be cast, or a song. And poetry is all three of those things. And so, it gives us, there has been this surge in poetry listening and viewing and reading since the pandemic. And for me, I think that it offers us two things. One is it makes us feel not so alone. I think of novelists as when I'm reading a novel, I feel like I'm and we get, completely enmeshed and, sort of excited about those stories. But for poetry, in some ways, I think it's almost like sitting across the table with a cup of coffee with a friend, and you're hearing the most intimate truths and joys that are being shared with you. And that's what I miss. Getting a little teary thinking about it. That's what I miss right now during the pandemic. And so I think that we get that sense of someone who's sharing a deepest truth in a language that we recognize as the one that we would have liked to have written ourselves or said ourselves. There's a reason why Maggie Smith's Good Bones, was the most popular book in 2016, because, she poetry book, because she, finds this way of articulating an incredible like desire for joy at the same time as an acknowledgement of terrible truths. And I think poetry is really, really good at doing that. And that's what we need right now. We need people to tell us the truth, and we need people to give us hope for a way out of the trouble. And poetry is doing a lot of that right now.
Oh, that's just so lovely. It's just so lovely. I hadn't ever thought of it that way, that conversation, like the intimate, the way that a novel is set out, and wonderful, of course, and it takes us places and helps us understand other perspectives. But the difference between a poem and that level of intimacy, and the words kind of fall out of, and poets work very hard at being intentful with how those words come out, but it feels so much more like the words coming out, how they're like tumbling out and how they're supposed to be, rather than editing it into a story.
And we need both. I'm not about literary hierarchies. We need novels, we need poems, we need memoirs. We need it all. But poetry fills that special place, that special function. And that's what I think is really exciting about bringing people into through workshops and through readings and through listening to poets, having conversations about their work. We started with the free generative writing workshops, and that's a monthly, absolutely free hour-and-a-half workshop every third Sunday. We're still doing that. We've been doing that for 7 years, and it was in a physical space at Public Space One, up until March, and now we've gone online. But we've had the most amazing writers, Alexia Arthurs, and just so many, Tamika Cage Conley, and all kinds of high-level writers, from the university and from the community, who have come and worked with all of us. We're not asking anyone to pay a fee to be in that monthly workshop. It's an hour and a half. And so we sit down, and I organized this workshop with Jenny Colville, who's the director of Prompt Press. And that's a really great local Iowa City writing organization too, that everyone should know about. So, this is an opportunity for people to have a little window into a working writer's mind with the prompt. We ask them to bring something that they are really excited about, that is important to them in their work right now. And then we write for 20 or 30 minutes. And I just can't tell you, that feeling of being in community writing while we're all so isolated. The gallery view is heartening and becomes inspiring while we're all writing. And we get back together at the end of the free generative workshop, and we're invited, no one's ever forced, but people are invited to let us overhear a little bit about these messy first drafts that they've just created. And I say messy first draft because that's what I always write, but the level of work that comes from people is always astounding, and it's humbling to always remember the level of talent that's in our community, and people who might not have PhDs, they're not teaching at the university, but they're creating exciting, heartfelt, engaging work. And it's just really an honor to kind of create the environment that facilitates that kind of communion and that kind of writing.
That's a very powerful thing, to create a space where people feel that they can be vulnerable and authentic. Like, that's the greatest gift I feel like you can give to people, that safety. And that's wonderful. I love Iowa City poetry. If you haven't noticed.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Right. Do you mind? Because that's not all you do either, even through the pandemic.
Well, that's the thing. It's just completely ironic that we retooled ourselves in March of 2020 at exactly the same moment that the pandemic hit us all. And we had begun to create even more original programming. You know, we really started in some ways as a little poetry calendar to let people know what's going on. You know, people, I think, didn't realize that there are so many free and accessible, you know, happenings at libraries, at the university, in the community. So we wanted that to be in one place. But in March of this year, last year, we decided that we wanted to offer many, many more original programs, bring more resources to more people. So we are offering extended workshops, low fee, 3-week, 4-week writing workshops to people. And it was quite an interesting challenge to decide what, how, when. We had always imagined that it would be a physical space. That, again, we'd be gathering, we'd be community at Public Space One or some other beautiful little DIY art space in Iowa City. And, you know, we couldn't do that. Those plans had to be completely retooled. And so, like everyone else, we got a pro Zoom account and decided to hold these workshops online. And so it's been incredibly exciting to have high level poets and teachers. Just these people are local, national, and international talents who've agreed to offer workshops with us. We offered 7 last year. And but the thing about it was that we always saw ourselves as a community writing organization, and we have lots and lots of participation and buy-in from people in Iowa City, Cedar Rapids, and Iowa. But of course, you know, the pandemic has given us an opportunity to welcome writers from all over. And so our workshops have seen writers from both coasts and also internationally. We've had writers from Mongolia, Spain, England, and Cairo, Egypt.
That's amazing.
It's amazing.
Oh my
It
goodness.
really is. And to hear the different voices and the different perspectives. Oh my goodness, a young writer who joined us from Mongolia was writing about the pandemic in her hometown and about the illness and the death that she was seeing all around her. And one of our writer from Egypt was writing about cultural practices and about resisting what she sees as some anti-woman, anti-feminist practices in her culture. And she's a spoken word poet. Like, oh, there's a strong spoken word community in Cairo, Egypt, and we've just connected with them.
That's incredible.
Fantastic.
Well, you know, I just looking at the calendar and your programs, like, it's an incredibly diverse body of poets. Even all of your contributors, like on the Iowa City Poetry website, there are bios for all the people that are working and making this happen, and it's an incredibly diverse bunch of people. First of all, but it never occurred to me that by having these workshops virtually, you could engage national and international audiences and really diversify not only the participants, but also what people are learning. I would never be able to travel to Cairo, maybe someday, you know, but to like be able to witness what's going on in another part of the world right now is an incredible thing.
Well, it is, and that's something we never could have anticipated when we began, because, you know, hello, Iowa City is in our name. We really always imagined ourselves as a community writing organization, but it's just exciting to have these cross-cultural conversations going on. We love it. Yeah, you know, we another amazing thing about being here in Iowa City is that there's just this incredibly rich pool of talent.
Mhm.
And so, you know, we have had no problem at all, you know, finding incredibly, you know, sort of talented, accomplished, and exciting teachers to work with us. And we're so grateful. You know, it's not like we're we're offering a king's ransom in, stipends. We're a little tiny nonprofit. And so we have writers who really want to reach out to the larger community, really want to engage with students beyond the university, and bring new perspectives on poetry and writing to them. So, one of our incredibly talented teachers really early on is Caleb Rainey, whom I think you might be talking with a little bit later.
In March.
Yeah. So wasn't he just voted best of the Crandic for poetry and spoken word? Yeah. And so here's Caleb, right? He is an accomplished spoken word poet who went through the university, also has 2 books out, and was willing and interested in offering a workshop called Hook, Line, and Sinker, using spoken word techniques to capture and hold an audience. So, wow, right? For us to get this insight from spoken word, where the initial impact of a poem is crucial, and being able to not only connect with readers first, but to keep and deepen and sort of develop and evolve the interest of your reader until you take them to a new place by the end of a poem. He shared with us his understanding of what top spoken word poets are doing and how he tries to incorporate that into his own writing. And so I think, we had about a fourth of the writers who signed up for that were spoken word poets, but the others were page poets, were people who really don't think of themselves as taking to the stage, but they were able to learn those techniques and to enjoy that. So that's been incredibly exciting for us.
Well, and it occurs to me too, that format is so great too. I love it when a teacher shows how they've learned and are continuing to learn. I think that is one of the most valuable parts of education. And
Well, you're modeling learning, right?
Exactly. Constantly. The world is ever changing. And so are we.
Yeah. And and then to sort of develop this spoken word connection for Iowa City Poetry, sometime in coming up in the next half year, Stephen Willis will be offering a workshop with us. And Stephen is a nationally acclaimed, award-winning spoken word poet his work is all over button poetry. And he's getting an MFA here at the University in Theater and Acting. I know.
Perfect.
And yes. So again, to have somebody who is so accomplished in his field, sort of work with local writers and apparently now other writers as well from beyond our community, is a real gift. And we're incredibly grateful to the teachers who are working with us. I do want to say that our workshops are fee-based, but as you know, part of our mission is to reach all writers. And so we do offer tuition assistance and sometimes waivers. So it's a very easy application process. And we have been able to offer every writer who's asked for assistance the level of assistance that they needed.
That is incredible.
We're proud of that. I mean, given what's going on now, right? So many people have lost their jobs, and there are no words. It's a terrible time, and to deny people, the opportunity to join a writing community and to have their voice and their work elevated and honored because they can't pay it would just be a travesty, and that's not what we're about.
That's incredible. I think that's kind of the perfect note to just let sit for a moment. I feel like that's so, it's just the most incredible mission to be able to accomplish. I think that it's remarkable how much work you put into this community in terms of, the people we have here and taking care of us, but also reaching out and finding all of those people that are doing good work and that are willing to share their time and talent. It's really
Well,
remarkable.
We're new. We're the little engine that could. And and we hope to be able to continue to could all the way to can. So we'll see how we can grow and develop in the new year.
Before we depart, we have a very specially curated recommended reading list from Lisa. So tell us what you brought for all of us in Library Land.
Oh my goodness. So Kiki Petrosino is a poet who got her MFA at the Iowa Writers Workshop and who also taught in the international summer programs for youth. And Kiki has a book out in 2021 called White Blood. And Kiki talks about her identity as a mixed race American. It's called White Blood, a Lyric of Virginia. And this is an incredible book that, maybe didn't get as much play this year because, we couldn't have readings, we couldn't have tours. And Kiki spent years doing research in Albemarle County and in Virginia about her family and into the Jefferson archives and Monticello, and is kind of recovering what she can of her own history and ancestry and dealing with absences and silences, many, which she finds along the way. And the first poem in the piece is, the first section is, the results that you get when you take a DNA test. And she took the pages and pages that come to you from those DNA test sites. Exactly. And created erasure poems from them. And so it's called What Your Results Mean, Western Africa, 28%. And it's just incredibly moving to see these blank spaces and these silences of the erasure, because so much of her own history and so many African Americans in our country, their history has been erased and silenced by slavery and by racism. And so I just cannot recommend highly enough this book that also has dramatic monologues of imagined ancestors speaking their truth from the past. So this is a beautiful, beautiful book. And Danez Smith is somebody who comes through Iowa City a lot through Mission Creek, the Mission Creek Festival in the spring. And so I had the incredibly lucky chance of hearing Danez Smith read a few years ago from their book, Don't Call Us Dead. Don't Call Us Dead. And I want to call everyone's attention to a poem called Dear White America. This poem is available on YouTube, incredibly powerful readings of Dear White America, and maybe you could link to some of those videos. Danez Smith came up as a spoken word poet, and he's one of those incredible talents who works equally well on the stage and then rewards rereading on the page, because the work is so dense and so powerful and so meaningful. And, I think at this moment that if we are Americans and we are white, and a poet like Danez Smith addresses us and says, Dear White America, I think it's time we listen.
That's lovely. That is so perfect. I'm so glad that you brought those titles for us, because I think it's one thing to have a discussion, but another to be able to take something with you and find it in the world and sit with it, whether you check out a book, or I noticed your Prairie Lights bookmark. That was a great shout out as well, right?
Of course.
But to be able to sit with some of these things that we've talked about, I think is really important. So I appreciate that very much. We will link the YouTube videos at the end of this. So all of you out there, stay tuned.
Wonderful.
You can find Iowa City Poetry online at iowacitypoetry.com, where you can learn about workshops, readings, interviews, the free generative workshop, and get in touch with Iowa City Poetry if you like. You'll also be able to stay abreast of what's coming up, including this workshop, Into Voices, with Stephen Willis and Caleb Rainey, and stay up to date on the Poetry Library coming soon, accessible digitally from the Iowa City Poetry website with a physical library at Public Space 1. Iowa City Poetry is also on Facebook, so you can visit Facebook and like to stay in touch with Iowa City Poetry and all the upcoming activities. You've been joining us for Read Woke. Thank you so much for watching, and if you have any questions about this program, any other program, or anything library related, please contact the library at 319-261-READ or visit crlibrary.org.